We're pleased to have the Chief of Sports Medicine at HSS, Dr. Andy Pearle, and with him, former NFL Pro Bowl tight end Greg Olsen, who is now a Fox Sports analyst, and even better, host of a new podcast called Youth Inc. If you're downloading on your phone, it's Youth Space Inc. It's all about youth sports and the dilemmas that parents face today. The session is titled Prioritizing Health and Safety, It's Time. It's ironic. Professional athletes like Greg, adults, are looked after by teams of medical pros, orthopedists, neurologists, injury prevention specialists. Most high schools don't even have one full-time athletic trainer. So it's fair to ask, we believe, what responsibility do schools and private programs have to offer health and safety protections for the minors in their care? How can these gaps be filled? So, over to you, Greg.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it, Tom. Thank you guys also so much for having me join you today. As Tom said, my name is Greg Olsen. I played 14 years in the NFL. I was a tight end. I got drafted by the Chicago Bears and then the Carolina Panthers. Spent one season in Seattle, and now I am a dad. I am a dad of 3 young kids. I have a 9 and 10-year-old boy-girl twins, and I have a 10-year-old son who are very involved in youth sports, like I'm sure all of you are, and have the opportunity to speak with Dr. Pearle about both injury prevention, best practices of returning from injury, and also the mental health effects that injury and overcoming these obstacles at a young age that these kids face. I'm super humbled and honored to be here. So Dr. Pearle, thanks so much, obviously, for sitting down, and I think this is going to be really informative for not only the folks here, but the folks following along online and whatnot, because this is something we as parents all fear for our children.
Well, thanks, Greg. It's a pleasure to be here. I, as you can tell, did not play in the NFL. I wear 2 hats, and I'm delighted to be here and be invited by Tom and talk to Greg. I'm the Chief of Sports Medicine at Hospital for Special Surgery, and I represent the program that you just learned about. But I, too, am a father of 4, 3 boys and a girl. I've been a tackle football coach for about 8 years, so I've lived the coaching life. In fact, I spent a lot of time outside of my practice, getting away from orthopedic surgery so I could spend time with kids and coach kids. So I want to thank you and all the coaches in the audience who have taught me a lot about your experiences, because I really identify it and appreciate it.
Yeah, and just following along throughout the course of the day, some of the breakout groups and some of the segments have been really informative for me. You know, again, as the reason behind starting Youth Inc. and starting this journey to better understand youth sports came really from what was a personal lifestyle, right? I grew up, my dad was a local high school football coach, coached in our hometown, little public school in New Jersey. All 3 boys, I had 2 brothers, went on to play college football. We lived our whole lives in this arena, you know, growing up around it and then making a career of it. And now as a father, I'm sitting here, you know, how do I keep my kids from being injured? What's the best team to put them on? You know, and just hearing the conversations go on throughout the course of the day, these are the exact same conversations that are happening back in our hometown of Charlotte, but also in our house between me and my wife. So as we dive in, you heard in the video, and I know you're a big part of this program, one of the biggest issues and obstacles facing, you know, injury prevention and education and keeping our young athletes healthy and on the field is this education and access to preventative care. Best practices of training, you know, whether that's in season or off season, whether that's, you know, practice prep, whether that's recovery. And then the fact that not every high school would have a full-time athletic trainer, I think back to my experience, we did, and just how fortunate we are. So what are those obstacles, and what are you guys doing through this program to try to bring that level of education and bring that level of access to these children so they don't end up in your operating room, so they don't end up going through a similar story of Tom's son, where they're down this road of injuries which tend to lead to further injury?
Yeah. Well, I think the country has awakened to the fact that there are ramifications to some of the common injuries that we see in sports, and I think concussion was a huge step forward, where people realized that it wasn't just, you know, a little head ding, it wasn't just a little concussion and you can go back the next day. There was a lot of work to educate the public that concussions and traumatic head injuries have long-term downstream effects. but I think we have to do a better job of educating the public that there are other injuries like that. People assume that injuries are just part of the game, when in point of fact, there are really well established ways to prevent injury. I'm a knee surgeon, and so my love is protecting knees. I'm kind of the Lorax of the knees. Unfortunately, I have to do a lot of ACL reconstructions, as you heard with Tom's son. They don't always work perfectly. Sometimes they recur. In fact, 20% of them recur. But what's amazing about ACL injuries is 50% of ACL injuries are preventable. That's 50%. Half of ACL injuries are preventable. And not a lot of people know that. People think, well, ACL injuries are pretty rare. They only happen in 5% of high school injuries or ACL injuries, but they're devastating. They can retire a kid. And in point of fact, if you tear your ACL, as you heard from Tom, there's a big chance that you tear another ACL, about a 20% chance. 1 in 5 kids tear a second ACL. And then downstream, kids have a 7 to 15 times higher rate of developing knee arthritis. And typically the knee arthritis develops 10 to 20 years down the road. So you think about a high school kid, it's kind of a rare thing, but high school kid tears their ACL, they may have to retire from their sport, and they may get arthritis 10 to 20 years down the road. So if you're a coach, I would think that that's a really serious thing that you want to consider. When you hear those numbers, when you think about one of your kids being an arthritic at the age of 30 and maybe needing a knee replacement at the age of 40, I want you as coaches to recognize that half of those injuries are avoidable. The way to avoid injuries, ACL injuries in particular, are some relatively simple exercises, and we can talk about that, but the exercises need to be done. The problem we have is we need to educate folks about the risk of ACL injuries, but more importantly, we have to implement these training programs.
Yeah, so what does that look like? When you say 50% of ACL injuries are avoidable, that seems like a pretty staggering number. I think everyone out there would say, great, let's cut it in half. That would be a great place to start. So I'm a father, I'm around a lot of youth organizations, coaching teams with my son and my daughters. What are things that we can do? Again, we're not doctors, we're not physical therapists. A lot of us are just dads and coaches. We have enough of background. What are easy things we can implement into our routine with our children to start chipping away at that 50%?
So it turns out if you have good body control, then you can avoid ACL injuries. This is a gender issue, so it's particularly important for girls who have a 6 to 8 times higher risk of ACL injuries. What do I mean by good body control? If you do certain exercises 3 to 5 times a week during the season, you can avoid the ACL injuries. What do they look like? Doing a perfect air squat, pretending you're in a phone booth and doing an air squat where you're not leaning over to one side or the other, you're not hitting the front, you're not hitting the back. Doing a lunge correctly, doing a hip hinge, doing toe raises, and doing landing exercises. Skater hops, which I'm sure you did all the time. Bounding and landing on one leg.
My brain's rattling right now as
Right.
I'm going through my exercise.
Jumping over a line like this on one leg and being able to balance. It's really body control or movement control, and there are very simple exercises that you can do to train. And coaches are not necessarily keyed in on the fact that if somebody can do a perfect air squat, they actually are protecting themselves against ACL injuries. And you got to do it all season long. You can't injure your toe and feel like you could do it at the beginning of the season, but now you've got a toe injury and you can't do a squat, and now your ACL's at risk. So you've got to do these exercises longitudinally through the school year.
Yeah, injuries always tend to lead to further injuries, whether it's related or as kind of a byproduct of overcompensation. Our bodies have an incredible way of overcompensating and fixing bad muscle patterns and bad firing functional patterns that, for years, I was telling you upstairs, I had hurt my left knee, thankfully not my ACL, my rookie year. And for 14 years, I played without a PCL in my left knee. It's non-operable, and you just kind of rehab it. But it was like a 15-year rehab. I mean, it never went away. For 15 years, I could not jump or land on one leg, but I could play in the NFL at the highest level and run around, and you would have no idea because my body learned to adapt. So to your point of treating injuries to prevent further injuries, I think is really important for people to understand, because if you don't, you'll find a way to do it, but it won't be done properly.
Exactly, and it's got to be a continuous thing through the year.
Yep.
You don't pass a test, you run a 40-yard dash, and that's it. So you've got to be doing these exercises through the year for it to be effective. These exercises that I'm talking about, they're called neuromuscular training, which is a mouthful, and kids don't like to do neuromuscular training, but they're actually pretty simple, and we know them. And by the way, they also reduce all time lost from injury by a third. So it's not just protecting the ACL, it's protecting the ankle, it's protecting the head, and they make you a better athlete. They're foundational movements. If you're just a baseball player and you just learn to throw and you forget how to squat, you're not going to be as good of an athlete as an athlete who's doing these foundational movements in multiple sports, and then they specialize a little later.
I think it's so interesting, and I think back to like my early exposure to what we would traditionally call weight training or training at a young age. I know typically it starts maybe middle school, but really starts in high school. And everyone wants to know your bench press, and they want to know all these more traditional, exercises. But what you're suggesting and what I'm hearing is for a lot of these coaches out there, especially at the younger age groups, something as simple as just landing mechanics, both single and double leg, plyometrics, understanding just functional body movements, body control. You're saying as far as preventing injury, maybe not, but that's also related to performance, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, performance and the ability to be available are directly tied together. So what would you say to coaches out there running strength and conditioning programs, summer workouts? Like, how vital is it that they layer in these exercises you're talking to in addition to the more traditional strength building, power generating exercises that we're used to?
Yeah, I think it's happening. Bill Parisi, some of the big strength and speeds.
I used to train at Parisi in Fairlawn.
I mean, he's big on this type of functional movement, and it's not just sagittal plane movement.
The crawling and the bear, all
right,
that.
and fascial training, but it's all this functional movement rather than bench pressing, curling, running in a straight line. So these movements are really foundational movements that allow you to accelerate, to land, to jump, to cut on a dime, to stop on a dime. And they make you more athletic. In fact, as we age, mature, we lose a lot of those things. And if you do them at my age, you actually can restore some athleticism that you kind of lose over time.
And I don't know about all your kids, I don't know about yours, but mine, when we want to do those exercises and we work on single leg landing mechanics or single leg, hip hinges, and be able to just go down and touch your toe with your opposite hand and stand back up, and they're wiggling and they can't up straight, and can we go work out? I say, well, how are we going to go run, but you can't stand on one leg, right? I mean, they're bored.
Right.
They're boring exercises. So the education of these young kids you're suggesting is so vital that they buy in.
It's not just education, it's the reinforcement from the coaches. So I think you saw on our sizzle video that we have a training program. We encourage coaches in schools, particularly without a trainer, to take our challenge, our Move Better, Play Better course and learn about how to implement these tools. We're trying to develop an app that makes it fun, a 7-minute workout where you can do this. I was thinking as I was coming here about the presidential fitness tests that we took, where you had to do push-ups and pull-ups and things like that. That's great for fitness to a certain extent, but it doesn't really make you an athlete if you can do a bunch of pull-ups. What makes you an athlete is, can you land on that one leg and stick the landing and change directions? Can you load and explode? And those are the types of boring exercises that allow you to play in the NFL.
So I trained my son's youth baseball team this winter. They all said they wanted to get, they're 10. They wanted to get faster. They want to hit it over the fence, right? And for the first 2 weeks, we worked on deceleration. And they're like, we want to get faster. We want to get faster. I said, you need to get better at slowing down. I said, I can't teach you to run faster. And then once you get to that speed, your body doesn't know how to get you back down to stationary. You're going to get hurt.
Right.
So we actually started working backwards. And as we layered it back into acceleration, change of direction, but it was from a foundation of landing mechanics, deceleration, it started to click in their young minds like, wait a minute, I feel more stable. I feel more confident that when I do really put my head down and accelerate, I'm in control. I don't feel like at any moment I could go out of whack. So to build all of this training on these fundamental foundational components that you're suggesting, I'm like wrapping it in my mind, like my next practice I go home. I'm like, we're gonna be doing this because Doc said this is the way to keep our kids healthy.
Let me just add to that. There's really good science behind this now. So there are a lot, FIFA 11, which is a warm-up program, has been shown to reduce ACL injuries by 50%, 80% in some populations. The science is rock solid. So the exercises are out there. We're trying to put them together in a way that's very easy for coaches to use and to monitor compliance of the kids. So it sounds like these exercises are complex, but they're really not. They're doing a great lunge. They're doing a great squat. They're doing a skater hop. They're bounding and landing on one leg. And so they're really well described. The issue with them is they have to be done the right way. You can't just do a squat and do a crappy squat and think that you're going to prevent injury. You can't have a kid who's wobbling during a hip hinge. They have to be disciplined, and the coach has to be disciplined, and the tools that we're developing have to be disciplined so that people are doing it the right way. It's not like the presidential fitness test where how many pull-ups can I do or how many push-ups can I do. It's can I do 10 squats the right way? Can I do lunges perfectly? Can I do scissor jumps perfectly and not be swaying back and forth?
Yeah, quality over.
Well, it's qualitative rather than quantitative.
Yep.
It's not how many push-ups, it's the quality of my movement.
Absolutely. Something you said earlier that I'd love you to kind of expound upon is, again, I have 2 sons and a daughter, and you mentioned that specifically ACL injuries have a gender component. And the numbers you said about how many times multiple the risk of a young girl versus a young boy has with knee injuries. I'd be curious, just can you expand about like why is that the case? Is it just like a predisposition anatomically? Is it the way we train them? Is it the way the sports they play? Like what is it about boys versus girls that have different risk factors?
Well, I'm part of the ACL study group. It's a group of international surgeons. We meet for a week and we talk about nothing but the ACL, which is tissue the size of a pinky. We are nerds, and we just nerd out about ACL.
Sounds great.
And these are the things that we argue and debate. And the bottom line is there's no resolution as to why, but I can tell you the numbers. The numbers are that girls are 4 to 8 times more at risk for ACL injuries than boys are playing the same sport. I'll give you some practical numbers. If you're a female high school athlete, every season that you play soccer, you have a 1.1% chance of tearing your ACL. So if you think about a girl who's playing soccer all year round, you say 4 seasons, that's a 4.4% chance of tearing it every year, or an over 16% chance in high school. So, it's the number for boys is lower. Boys in football, so the 2 highest risk groups are boys playing football in high school and girls playing soccer. The mechanism in football tends to be a contact mechanism, which we can't protect very well against. In girls and in many boys, it tends to be a non-contact ACL, as you heard with Tom's son, where they plant, cut, and because they don't have great body control, they pop their ACL.
Yeah, and then the exercises that you were suggesting prior, do they have similar impacts? Do you see similar success? Is that broken down by gender, or is that 50% prevention, the ability, is that pretty universal across the board?
The data is stronger for girls.
So we can prevent more ACL female injuries than we can male by following these protocols you're talking about?
Exactly, 100%. The data is very, very strong that in female athletes, ACL prevention programs are wildly effective. Up to 80% of ACL injuries are reduced in certain female populations. So the data is most compelling in the female high school athlete, particularly playing field or court sports, particularly soccer, lacrosse, basketball, volleyball.
Yeah, the open field running. My daughter's now going to eat dinner standing on one foot. We're going to throw her into that 80%. So another factor that I know is like a hot button topic, not only here this week, but just across the sports landscape, is the idea of sports specialization and the idea of just repetitive actions, repetitive movements, whether it's a baseball kid throwing the ball a lot or a football player who never stops. He's doing, fall, he's doing summer 7-on-7, whatever. What are you seeing in the orthopedic world are the ramifications physically as far as the injuries that are as a result now of this specialization culture that we've created where kids never take a break and they do the same sport, in essence, 10, 12 months a year?
Well, I think it gets back to, when you specialize, you lose some of these foundational movement exercises and training and strengthening that you get when you play a multitude of sports. So if you're a baseball player, you don't need to squat perfectly to throw. And you actually do have to have great balance on your push leg, but you overtrain different body parts. And if you're doing that all year round, I think that leads to injury. We were talking a little bit before that at the major league level, I'm involved with the Mets organization, we're seeing guys at the major league level blow out tissues that they never blew out before. Like major league pitchers can blow out the lat, which is this enormous muscle. And it's because they've trained everything else so much that they now can exert so much force on their lat that they can blow out their lat. And if you go downstream of that, back to the youth level, kids are overtraining in such a way that they're blowing out things like their UCL of their elbow that they never used to do at 10 or 12 because they're hyper training. They're not taking the strength, the time off. They're not going back to these foundational movements that you get when you play lots of sports, and you overtrain with one particular movement, which at the lower level now is, it used to be that the professional pitchers would blow out their UCL, and now it's kids, and now the professional pitchers are so tuned up that they're blowing out things that we never thought people could blow out before.
Yeah, so what do you say, okay, so in the traditional sense, when you play, let's just take team sports for this conversation, say in the fall you do soccer or you do football or whatever, and then shortly after, take my experience in high school. We played football in the fall. The second football ended, that next day we were at basketball practice.
Right.
And we would go through the winter, and then when that ended, half the kids would go play baseball, the rest of us went and played track,
right.
And then summer was football again. So we never really took a break in general. We took a break from particular sports, but what am I doing for my body? I mean, when I went from football practice, running around, contact, a lot of load, when I went to basketball practice, I wasn't really giving my joints and my body a break. I was just changing. Is it the change in movements that is the break, even though I'm not really, in essence, conventionally sitting home with my feet up relaxing?
I think so. I mean, I think there are sport-specific movements. Even the breakdown for a tackle seems different than breaking down to play defense in basketball. I mean, it seems similar, but it's not exactly the same.
Right.
There are different muscle groups that you're using when you're really breaking down for a tackle and shooting and shooting through a ball carrier, and that's different from playing good defense. They're similar. They're actually similar athletic movements, but if you do a sports-specific movement over and over and over and over again, I think that is what wears out the body. It's an extreme movement in football. I mean, you see this in hockey players too.
Yeah,
They just play hockey. They really tear up their hips by the position that they're in all the time.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I want to transition just a little bit. We've talked a lot about preventing people from ending up in your OR and people, preventing their child from getting injured. But let's say your child does get injured, right? It's a hard moment for the family. Of course, your child most likely is, upset and devastated, and especially something as significant as an ACL, they know they have a long road ahead of them. What is the best first steps, right? If your child comes home and he tears his ACL, say, what are the questions that they should ask? What are the resources that are at these parents' disposal that they can get both the acute care they need in the OR, but they can get the pre-op care? I know that's super important now. Before having major knee surgery. There's almost a rehab before the surgery. And then, of course, post-surgery with the rehab that could be as long as a year. Like, what are those steps that families can take to ensure as good of a result as possible?
Well, the overarching thing I would say is it's not a race to get back on the field.
Okay.
I think particularly with ACL surgery, the steps for the prehab, as we call it, the surgical technique, and the rehab it's pretty consistent across the country. It's been well studied. You have nerds like me and the ACL study group just thinking about it and publishing on it. But I think the fallacy or the problem is it almost gets competitive as to who can go back first, who can get back the earliest, who can be the next Adrian Peterson. And I would encourage coaches and parents to give kids the time they need to fully recover. Because if you tear your ACL a second time, it's a really big deal. You may have to retire as a high school kid. And it leads to all sorts of downstream things, problems, as we alluded to, the arthritis and whatnot. So I would encourage coaches in particular, but parents, to recognize that it's a serious injury, to allow the process to happen, and the goal is to get somebody back on the field, but to not get them back on the field so that they can go then destroy their knee, to get them back on the field so they can be an athlete for a lifetime.
Yeah, so, and for someone, say, that didn't grow up in this world, someone that doesn't maybe have the resources and the connections to navigate it, they don't know who the right orthopedic surgeon is, they don't know who the right physical therapist is, what do those parents do? Are there resources for these families? Is it going to be school driven? I mean, we just talked about how a lot of these schools don't even have athletic trainers. So how are these families supposed to make all of these important decisions that are going to last a lifetime?
Yeah.
With, like, what is that process? Like, where do you turn if you're not familiar with that world?
Yeah, I mean, navigating the world of medicine can be a little bit challenging. You turn to coaches, parents, families, community to see who the best local surgeon is in your community, whether it's a guy or a girl. You know, lean on your pediatrician. You can look at health grades and things like that. I'm biased. I think that sports surgeons should be doing ACL reconstruction, so you try and find somebody who's specialized in sports surgery, and we do have a certification for that, so I would look towards that certification in your surgeon.
That makes sense. Yeah, the last component, and you touched on it a little bit when you talked about rushing back to action, I think that kind of falls under this bucket that's kind of overarching all of these issues, which is kind of the mental health component that sports can have, not only on young kids. We see mental health now having an impact on professionals at the highest level who are struggling to deal with setbacks, injury, failure, whatever it is. So now you put yourselves into the shoes of a young kid who was, had a devastating, say a knee injury, has gone through 8 months, 10 months. They're getting close enough that they're feeling like themselves, where now the conversation starts to be had where it's return to action.
Yeah.
What can we do as parents? What can we do as coaches to help facilitate that transition, deal with any fears, any sort of, hesitations? Am I going to be as good as I was when the last time I took the field? Am I going to get injured again?
Yeah.
There's a lot of pressure on these kids, as you said, to get back and be expected to get back at the highest level right away. Like, what can we do to kind of ease those fears for young kids, that this is probably the most challenging thing they've been through at this point in their lives as of this point?
Yeah, that's a great question, Greg. And, I'd like to point out a couple stats. Only 70% of high school soccer players, for example, get back to playing. So not every kid gets back to playing. In the NFL, 62% of people get back to playing. Now, if you're a first or second round draft choice, it goes way up. And actually in the NFL, for running backs and wide receivers, your fantasy numbers go down by a third if you tear your ACL and come back. Little note for fantasy football.
For all you fantasy football GMs out there, mental note.
But what I think the point I want to make is not everybody has to go back, because it is a long recovery, and there is, as I said, a 20% chance of re-injuring it. And it's okay to choose another sport. So I'm a sports surgeon. My goal is to get people back on the field, but I wouldn't ever push people back on the field. And sometimes, as I'm sure you all see, it's the parent or the coach who wants their kid to go back, and the kid may not want to go back. The kid may want to do something else athletically or with their life, or be on the chess team or whatever it is. And I don't think that that's a bad thing. And I've had plenty of conversations where I actually have the parents leave, and I ask the kid, what do you want to do? Yeah. And they I don't want to play anymore. I don't want to play anymore. This was a lot of pressure. Then I tore my ACL. Everybody's driving to get me back. Yeah. It doesn't feel right. What I went through was terrible, and I don't want to play. Yeah. And so I would, as coaches and parents, be open to having that conversation, because it's okay, as the Lorax of the knee, it's okay to choose a different sport or go on with other things and have an athletic lifestyle that doesn't necessarily involve soccer.
Well, I think that's the perfect message to kind of end on. We have a phrase that we use a lot on our podcast. We say, as long as it's kid-driven and then family-supported, typically it has a good result, right? So to hear that perspective, that when you're able to have that connection with those kids and they can give you the honest, truthful, like, I don't want to do this anymore.
Yeah.
The burden that falls off their shoulders when they're not living their parents' life and their parents are just supporting their life is a so much healthier experience for everybody. And speaking myself, we can all probably be better at that as parents, but I think that's a great final message for you. Well, Doc, I appreciate your I'm so used to that.
I am a coach.
You are.
Thank you.
See, I really
Call
think
me
of
by
you
my
more
true name,
as more of
yeah.
a youth tackle football coach than you are a doctor. The doctor thing is like a part-time hobby.
Yeah.
But no, Doc, I really appreciate your time. This was fun. I hope everybody enjoyed it. Do we do a Q&A now, or are we done? We're done. That's it. Easy. Thank you, guys.